Well, welcome back and good evening to you all. Excuse me, I am Marcy Mederi. I'm the Director of Spirit and Light. And so welcome to the second of three in our Christian Mysticism series with Peter O'Leary. And so it's good to have you back. Good for those online and those who have yet to see this. I guess quite a few folks watched the recording from last week. And so if you're here and you didn't see last week's, it's on our YouTube channel. So I get to have the prayer. And tonight we are going to have a little poem from Julian of Norwich. And because I believe we're talking about Julian tonight. So let's just pause, put ourselves in the place of prayer, remembering that we are in the holy presence of God. And Julian says, "We are of God. That is what we are. I saw no difference between God and our substance, but as if it were all God. And yet my understanding took this to mean that our substance is in God. That is God and our substance is a creature in God. For the all-capable fidelity of the Trinity is our Father, for he created us and keeps us in him. The deep wisdom of the Trinity is our mother. In her we are all enclosed. The high goodness of the Trinity is Christ, in whom we are all enclosed, and Christ in us." And so we pray in thanksgiving for deep wisdom, in gratitude for the gifts that we have, for blessings upon this conversation, that your Spirit, Lord, might flow through it all. We ask this in all the holy names of God. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. I'd like to bring up Tim Flash. He's got some words for us.
Thank you, Marcy. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great, thank you. I just want to say thank you to everyone present here in the room and our live stream viewers actually around the world. We've got a lot of people in the States, in Europe, and even Australia. So thank you to all of you who are interested in this path to mysticism. We had over 250 views last week, so that's really fantastic and speaks to people's keen interest in this talk and speaks to Peter's passion as an educator and how he transmits something that's very complex in a way that makes it available to us. His book is for sale. His latest book is for sale, and I'll be selling that in the back. It's cash, Venmo, or PayPal, okay? It's $20, and it's called The Hidden Eyes of Things by Peter. And he's also written 7 books of poetry. So he brings a lot of wisdom and insight. He's a passionate catechist to our youth for over 20 years. So we're grateful for Peter's presence here and the wisdom and the humor and the wit that he brings forward to us. So Peter, whenever you're ready, come forward.
Thank you, Tim. Okay, I have the microphone turned on, and I hope that you can hear me well enough. I do project, so great to see everybody here, and I'm pleased that we resolved our technical situation. Those of you who were here last week, it's all resolved, so we can get going right away. I'll give you just a little forecast of what's going to happen. similar to last week. I'll speak for about 40 minutes, maybe 45 or so. And then we'll take a brief pause to allow, no pause, we're just going to keep going. Oh, okay, no, I'm sorry. I'm staying corrected, no pause. We're doing no pause, we're going to go right into, we'll do a few questions afterwards, okay? So, without further ado, I didn't explain the painting last week. This is a panel from a painting by the great Flemish painter Hieronymus Bosch. It's his depiction of the ascension into paradise. That's what that kind of tunnel form up at the top of the painting is. Over the summer of 2022, I had the good fortune to see the painting. It was traveling in a show that was, the exhibition was in Budapest, and I spent a month in Budapest that summer, and I got to go see this thing. It's like many of Bosch's paintings, it's quite small, much smaller than you'd think. Maybe it's about the size of the paintings that are on the wall there. That's just not a huge, you'd think this would be a monumental work of art. It's really small. The feature of it that was most, just most edifying, amazing, the painting is luminous. That is, it gives off light. I don't know how he did it technically. There's some sort of alchemical secret that he was engaged in, but particularly that tunnel of light at the top, it just, you couldn't believe the light it was casting off. And it was so particular, so minute in its characterizations. It was really, really something. So, this is the Threefold Path, the Threefold Way, an introduction to Christian mysticism, and we're going to explore illumination in this lecture. I want to start, however, with a repetition of the material that I started with last week, which orients all three lectures. So those of you who are here, you'll forgive a little redundancy, or maybe you'll appreciate a little refreshment. And for those of you who might not have been here last week, this will orient you to the material, okay? So the classic formation of the threefold way to mystical union with God was first formulated by an unknown figure who called himself Dionysius the Areopagite. The name comes from a rock, the Areopagus, which is next to the Parthenon in Athens. It was devoted to the god Ares. That's the Areopagite, or Areopagus. And he's the figure that appears in the 17th chapter of Acts and is converted from paganism to following Christ, thanks to Paul's preaching. But even though people believed for many years that for centuries, or accepted, might be a better word for it, for centuries that the writings of Dionysius came from this New Testament figure, the likely truth is that he was a Syrian monk who lived in the early 6th century. Dionysius taught through his coinage of the word hierarchy that the universe consists of a sacred order, a state of understanding, and an activity approximating as closely as possible to the divine. By envisioning this hierarchy, the soul is brought back to union with the hidden divinity. This process of vision, according to Dionysius, involves 3 stages. First, purification, which we covered last week. Also, purgation. And you'll remember, I gave you the Greek words for these. I'll just write them here for the value of repetition. Catharsis, in which the soul is cleansed of its stains. Second is illumination, which is theoria. in which the soul gazes upon the dazzling darkness of the divine. And third, union, henosis, in which the soul is absorbed into the wholeness of God. Okay? We're doing theoria, illumination this week. Okay? So I'm going to skip ahead on my slides. I have all the slides from last week. I just kept it on the same file. So avert your gaze if you don't want to see flickering lights. And that might include the internet too, if there are people there. All right, here we are. There's the refreshment. I just gave you the mystical itinerary. And we're talking about illumination, theoria, and we can also imagine this as contemplation. Illumination and contemplation, they're synonymous on this particular path. And this is the state in which and through which the imagination is powerfully activated. So I'd like to use imagination here in the sense assigned to the word by Henry Corbin, the great scholar of Islamic mysticism, who wrote repeatedly of the power of the active imagination, which he understood to be the means through which what he calls the recurrent creation can be visualized and then contemplated, enabling a method of understanding which transmutes sensory data and rational concepts into symbols. That's a mouthful. I'll repeat it because I'm quoting from Corbin. It's this visualization and contemplation enable a method of understanding which transmutes sensory data and rational concepts into symbols. Okay? Creation in this regard is an epiphany. It's a word that Corbin used frequently in his writings, as well as words like theophany. We won't get into that, but epiphany. And quoting him again, a passage from the state of occultation, which just means hiddenness, a passage from the state of occultation or potency to the luminous, manifest, revealed state. Corbin insists, as Aristotle did, that the imagination is what the soul sees through. Actually, what Aristotle said is the soul sees with images. The soul sees with images. Okay? And this idea of image and its relationship to the imagination, that's the thing we're exploring today with illumination. Okay? The relationship between what you see, the images that you see, and the imagination. For Aristotle, they're effectively the same thing. They're effectively the same thing. And what you're seeing with is not it's not your optic nerve, so to speak. You're seeing with your soul. The word that Aristotle used for this, which is a valuable word in the context of what we're talking about, is phantasmata. Phantasmata. We get the word phantasm from this, but he means things that you see with your eyes. We also get the word fantasy from this, and in our world and the way we use language presently, that word tends to be degraded or it's not taken seriously. You know, the most common associations with fantasy are things that have to do with children, things that have to do with dragons, sometimes those are the same thing, or things that have to do with eros. Things, we think about erotic fantasies, for instance, okay? But for Aristotle, that is it. Fantasy is what the imagination does. That's it. It is projecting fantasy. It is feeling, it is thinking fantasy. And this is the activity of the imagination for the mystics that we're going to be looking at this evening. They are drawing down images from creation. They're projecting them back out through their writings, through what they say and do. So let's recall the two coinages we introduced last week, thearchy and hierarchy. Hierarchy, which is lower here, is visualized for us in the ranks of angels whom we can understand as multiple manifestations of the divine beauty which lift us up towards God. And then thearchy is Dionysius's dynamic synonym for the Trinity, which he characterizes as a multiplex, ordered manifestation of the divine that illumination reveals to us, the triune God who communicates himself in creation. Those are the two terms that Dionysius coined, and they help us start to visualize and see what's happening here. So, put another way, the essence of God is always unknown and unknowable to us. The energy of God manifests for us in the thearchy, which we approach in contemplation through the imagination, whose mediation illuminates us. Again, it's kind of a mouthful, but what I want you to be able to take in is the notion that when you contemplate the divine, you have to activate your imagination. You can't do it without the imagination. William Blake believed, the great poet William Blake, he believed that the imagination was the part of us that is most like God. If you want to know what God's like, God is fantasizing constantly. God is engaging the imagination continuously. And that energy, the energy of the divine, that's what we're activating when we engage our imaginations. So, this light, the light of illumination, abstract as it sounds, shows us the cataphatic or positive way, the via positiva, to God through visualization, attribution, and imagination. How is this accomplished? In part by praising all of creation, in which the beneficent providence of the divine can be found. So the purpose, and I'm giving you these two characterizations. Last week we talked about the via negativa, which is to say the apophatic way, the way of negative theology. This week we're going to focus more on the via positiva, which is the cataphatic way, the way of affirmation and vision. And I just wanted to give you a little etymology there at the bottom of this slide. Cataphatic from kata, which is an intensifier, plus phanein, to speak. Therefore, cataphasis is affirmation. It's just speaking intensively. I like the word. So the purpose of cataphatic mysticism is to praise, to imagine, and to illuminate, but also to return us to our need to go beyond all things to their divine source, the light beyond all divinity, as Dionysius calls it. The way of illumination is a way of visualization, of vision. As a mysticism, it involves seeing things in all of their squalor and their splendor, and through them seeing the angelic and the heavenly realms. We talked a little bit about that last week. Suffused with the uncreated light of God. Uncreated light means it's not made, it's not wrought into creation. It's not something that God made. It's the light that comes from beyond creation, outside of creation. Uncreated light. The second of the threefold path is a way of transfiguration, as clarifying as it is beguiling and transforming. So I want to share with you the words of this monk of the Eastern Church, published anonymously under that particular name, but we know who he is. There's a photo of him. This is a little statement from a monk of the Eastern Church. I love this statement. We could therefore define every vision granted to us on earth as an anticipation and reflection, however dim, of the vision of God in heaven. Generally speaking, there is an ascending gradation in the external phenomena of the spiritual life. This gradation begins with words and finishes with vision. At first, one listens to God. At the end, one sees him. In this lecture, 4 mystics will describe for us the mind's journey to God, as St. Bonaventure, one of our mystics, calls it. The others are St. Francis, Julian of Norwich, whom we've already heard a little bit from, and Thomas Merton. Last week, Father Bob Hootmacher was here. He's a Franciscan, and I think he's actually in Assisi right now. He said, I can't be here next week because I'll be at the source. I thought, that's probably better. Probably better than the lecture here. So let's start with St. Francis. There he is right in the center there. So St. Francis lived from 1181 or 2 to 1226. He's the founder of the Franciscan order, and he was perhaps first and foremost a nature mystic. As saint, religious figure, and exemplar, he is beloved. Surely the best loved and best known Christian besides Christ himself. I would wager. I think nobody has a bad opinion about Francis. How can you? Born well-to-do, he shifted his focus, arising from a period of imprisonment during a border dispute between Assisi and Perugia, working among lepers, repairing a church, San Damiano, and reading Matthew's gospel, which led him to discard wealth, to dress simply, and to serve the poor, preaching the gospel through simplicity. Before long, others joined him, and the order of the Friars Minor was formed. He preached throughout southern Europe and Egypt. In 1224, he experienced the stigmata. He was canonized in 1228. In 1979, John Paul II named him patron saint of ecology. So Francis was not a literary person. He left behind only a small body of writings, but each piece of writing he left behind is a cataphatic powerhouse, especially the Canticle of the Sun, a rhapsodic jubilation of the natural world, revealing Francis's archaic theology teeming with the elements of creation themselves. And I'm going to read for you the translation by the American poet Ezra Pound. His translation is in the context of, he's translating this in the context of this spiritual and mystical revival that captured southern Spain, southern France, and northern and central Italy in the 12th century, which he refers to through the label, the spirit of romance, or in another sense, the phantom dawn, he called it. His translation has a slight archaic quality to it, but I think it serves the poem itself really beautifully. So this is the Canticle of the Sun, Cantico del Sole. Most High Lord, yours are the praises, the glory and the honors, and to you alone must be accorded all graciousness, and no man there is who is worthy to name you. Be praised, O God, and be exalted, my Lord of all creatures, and in especial of the Most High Sun, which is your creature, O Lord, that makes clear the day and illumines it, whence by its fairness and its splendor it is become thy face. And of the white moon be praised, O Lord, and of the wandering stars created by you in the heaven, so brilliant and so fair. Praised be my Lord, by the flame whereby night groweth illumined in the midst of its darkness, for it is resplendent, is joyous, fair, eager, is mighty. Praised be my Lord of the air, of the winds, of the clear sky, and of the cloudy, praised of all seasons, whereby live all these creatures of lower order. Praised be my Lord by our sister, the water, element, meetest for man, humble and chaste in its clearness. Praised be the Lord by our mother, the earth, that sustaineth, that feeds, that produceth multitudinous grasses and flowers and fruitage. Praised be my Lord by those who grant pardons through his love, enduring their travail and patience, and their infirmity with joy of the Spirit. Praised be my Lord by death corporal, whence escapes no one living. Woe to those that die in mutual transgression, and blessed are they who shall find in death's hour thy grace that comes from obedience to thy holy will, wherethrough they shall never see the pain of the death eternal. Praise and give grace to my Lord. Be grateful and serve him in humbleness, even as ye owe. Praise him, all creatures. That's Pound. It's good. Smoking good. And that feels like just such a summation of this cataphatic way. Francis's Canticle of the Sun lights the way on the Via Positiva for us, showing us where the silver thread of creation we can follow lies, as well as the shadows that mass at the sides of the path. And I want to emphasize that a little bit more, because you see Via Positiva and you think it needs to be all, sunshine and or lollipops or whatever else. It's not. It's what you see. It's what's there before you. It's unlike the Via Negativa, where you're actually moving away from these characterizations towards a kind of, we might call, abstraction. In this case, you're enumerating, you're describing, you're characterizing. And that's going to include things that are challenging and difficult as well. So it's not entirely this luminous process of praising, but I'll emphasize the metaphor I gave you again. It's a silver thread that guides you along the path. And you're aware that there are shadows. There's a great line in a poem by the 20th century American poet Robert Creeley, where he says, "The darkness surrounds us." Sometimes it's actual, sometimes it's metaphorical, sometimes it's symbolic. But I repeat that line often. The darkness surrounds us. St. Bonaventure. So Bonaventure was born in Italy, in Bagnoregio. He joined the Franciscan order in 1243, moving quickly to Paris in 1244 in order to study. In 1253, he was actually in Paris studying at the same time as Thomas Aquinas. It's kind of interesting. They were there together. In 1253, he became master of the Franciscan school in Paris until 1257, when he was elected minister general of the order. His Life of St. Francis became the founder's official biography, and still basically is. It's still in print. Bonaventure's was an unusually lucid mind, comprehensive but questing, systematic but visionary. Theologian, Franciscan friar, teacher, mystic, Bonaventure was canonized in 1482 and declared a doctor of the church in 1588, known as the Seraphic Doctor because of the refinement and holiness of his thought, and became the focus, and because of the focus on the seraphic vision in his most significant work of mystical thought, which is the Itinerarium Mentis in Deum, the journey of the mind to God, which mixes Dionysian and Neoplatonic mysticism with Franciscan experiential spirituality, structured around 6 levels of progressive contemplation, symbolized by the 6 wings of the crucified Christ seraph figure that appeared to St. Francis. There's a depiction of Francis receiving the stigmata and visualizing this 6-winged Christ seraph. That's the being with the red wings up in the upper right corner. Obviously, that's Francis kneeling and receiving the stigmata. So this was a focal image for Bonaventure. This is an example of somebody who is schooled in and whose mind is so well adapted to negative theology, but who is capable of using this visualization as a way of providing an understanding of how the path to God might be followed, how the path to God might appear. And he referred to this work as the journey of the mind to God, the itinerarium. So for Bonaventure, as for Dionysius, creation is the overflow and expression of God's divine self-communication, the word that stands as archetype for all creation. Christ incarnate is the hidden center of the world. Thus, every creature, because it speaks God, is a divine work, is a divine word. So I'll repeat that to get over my stumbling. Thus, every creature, because it speaks God, is a divine word. All things are, he uses a fancy word here, theonomous in their being. That is, arising from the law or rule of God. Autonomy, according to Bonaventure, does not belong to creation. So I'll write that word theonomous right here. Theonomous. It's like autonomous, but with God. It's the rule of God, the law of God. Nomos is Greek for rule or law. So all beings are theonomous. All things are theonomous in their being. That is, we're all moving towards, we are all guided by the divine. So claims Bonaventure. He believed in the journey of the mind to God. He believed that in the journey of the mind to God, we must pass through 6 ascending stages of creation and vision to enter the highest stage of union with the divine. And for Bonaventure, the vision of the 6-winged Christ seraph both focuses and expands our vision in this process. So, let me read for you a couple of passages from the itinerarium. First, in accord with our created state, the universe itself is a ladder for ascending to God. Among things, we find some that are vestiges and some that are images, some that are corporeal, some spiritual, some that are temporal, some everlasting, and hence some that are outside us, others within us. In order to come to thoughtful consideration of the first principle, which is totally spiritual and eternal and above us, we must pass through the vestiges that are corporeal and temporal and outside us. This is to be led along God's path. Then we must enter into our own mind, which is God's image, everlasting, spiritual, and within us. This is to go into God's truth. Finally, we must pass beyond to what is eternal, totally spiritual, and above us, by gazing toward the first principle. This is to rejoice in the knowledge of God and reverence for his majesty. So in this passage, Bonaventure is visualizing a ladder to allow us to climb into the vision he has seen so clearly. And we have to first pass through the world of things. And we have to be able to identify it. And that allows us to enter into ourselves, to move inward. And once we've come far enough inward, then we're able to pass beyond ourselves into, as he puts it here, the first principle, or toward the first principle, to rejoice in the knowledge of God and reverence for his majesty. And so here he's going to give us, furthermore, a sense of these 6 steps as they relate to the 6 wings of the seraph. Just as there are 6 steps of ascent to God, there are also 6 levels of the soul's powers by means of which we ascend from the depths to the heights, from exterior things to those within, from temporal things to those eternal. They are sensation, imagination, reason, intelligence, understanding, and the high point of the mind, or the spark of synderesis, which means consciousness. I'll write that word in just a moment. These levels are implanted in us by nature, deformed through sin, reformed through grace, purged through justifying grace, exercised through knowledge, and made perfect through wisdom. So let me write down the six stages that he imagines us mounting here for you, just because I think they're really potent. I'm going to go from the bottom up, okay? We start with sensation. We go to imagination. You can see we're on the via positiva there. Then we go to reason. Then we have intelligence. Then we have understanding. And then finally, we come to, he uses this word synderesis, which is consciousness. Okay? We ascend from the depths to the heights, from exterior things to those within, from temporal things to those eternal. And these are the steps of the ladder. According to Bonaventure, on our itinerarium, our journey of the mind to God, we begin in nature, move through sin, grace, purgation, into knowledge, and arriving finally at wisdom. So he claims for us. So he claims for us. And the itinerarium provides these particular descriptions of how to accomplish what seems like an incredibly abstract undertaking. I'm going to use these 6 wings of this Christ seraph. Each one of them belongs to one of these aspects. It also transforms into a ladder, and I'm going to use that to climb out of the shackles of what we might call, rationality, rationalizing. You're not using your rational mind when you undertake this. You have to learn a way to part ways with it. But we do it all the time. It's something that we naturally do all the time. Every time you fall asleep and have a dream, you have parted ways with your rational mind. And it doesn't trouble you unless the content of the dream is troubling, which is, alas, sometimes the case. But you do it all the time. When you daydream, you do it all the time when your thoughts start to drift. You're not shackled to your rational mind all the time. And what Bonaventure is suggesting is, not only could you, let's say, isolate yourself in a monastic cell and abstractly contemplate the divine as a way of freeing yourself from your desire for rationality. But you could also use these powerful images, an image like this, and form it in your imagination as well as in your visual cortex, and use that as a way of starting to release yourself from the overwhelming desire to rationalize everything that happens to us. So this is part of the pleasure of reading somebody like Bonaventure, because on the one hand, he's very straightforward, and on the other hand, he's unremittingly mystical in his goals. You can be both at the same time, strangely enough. And this positive way, at least in this instance, he has a lot of negative theology in him as well. I don't mean bad theology. I mean apophatic theology. There's a lot in Bonaventure there as well. But in this element, he's showing us a way, as is the great Julian of Norwich. And there's a sculpture of her. We don't really have there's no likenesses of her. It's just it's a supposition. So Julian, you can see, lived, basically almost a couple hundred years after Francis and Bonaventure. Julian was an English anchorite who lived from around 1342 to 1420. Anchorite means she lived a life peculiar to her time, which is a life of voluntary solitude, in which she had lived in an enclosed cell from which she could not exit, attached to the wall of the church of St. Edmund and St. Julian in East Anglia. Anchorite is a late Middle English term derived from the Latin anchorita, which itself came from an ecclesiastical Greek term for someone who retires from a place, or more largely the world. Okay? I want to emphasize the peculiarity of her life to you just a little bit more, so that it takes inhabitation in your imaginations, which is she lived most of her life, her adult life, enclosed in this stone cell, the stone habitation, which was attached to the wall of her church. So imagine across the street at St. Giles if there were a stone structure which was connected to the outer wall of the church, and somebody was entirely enclosed inside of that. There's no way for her to exit from this. She couldn't get out to live there. She was actually enclosed in by the masons or whoever built it for her. There were windows, there were little slots so that food could be brought to her, and she could communicate with people who were there, because her holiness was considered to be significant, and people would come seeking the counsel, the advice, the presence of a person like her. And then there was also a slot through which she could look into the church and from which she could receive communion. That's it. For her life, she's there. So wild. Think about that. Think about taking steps like that. So in her cell, I just explained all that. When she was 30, near death from illness, she was granted 16 mystical visions on the passion of the Christ and the Trinity, which she recorded in sensuous detail in a collection she called Showings, which is also known as Revelations of Divine Love, in which she generates original language for her experience regarding God as Father and Mother, and Jesus as brother, Savior, and Mother, and the Holy Spirit as spouse. Not unusual for medieval Western European Christians, but intensified greatly in her writings. That is, God as both Father and Mother, Christ as brother, Savior, and Mother. Her work is filled with birthing metaphors as a way of approaching spiritual life. And I just want to underscore the word showings. It's a great word for illumination. Illumination comes from the Latin. We have a lot of Latinate words in the religious language we use to talk about religious experience, because it's so important and such a source. But some of these Middle English and Old English words, they're more direct. Showings. She's having visions. Showings. She doesn't use the word vision. She uses the word showings. I was shown these things. And there's that quality of light that's direct there. I really love the word. Revelations of Divine Love. Yeah, that's fine. That's a good title. It's accurate. Showings. That's worthy of Walt Whitman. That is good. That is good. Vision allows Julian into the mystical realms. Her revelations involve her experience of divine love, which saturated her entirely. So, I'm going to give you, to add to what Marcy started with this evening, I'm going to give you a couple of additional tastes of Julian. Then I suddenly saw the red blood trickling down from under the crown of thorns, hot and fresh and very plentiful, as though it were the moment of his passion when the crown of thorns was thrust onto his blessed head, he who was both God and man, the same who suffered for me like that. I believed truly and strongly that it was he himself who showed me this without any intermediary. And as part of the same showing, the Trinity suddenly filled my heart with the greatest joy. And I understood that in heaven it will be like that forever and for those who come there. For the Trinity is God. God is the Trinity. The Trinity is our maker and protector. The Trinity is dear friend forever, our everlasting joy and bliss, through our Lord Jesus Christ. And this was shown in the first revelation and in all of them. For it seems to me that where Jesus is spoken of, the Holy Trinity is to be understood. And I said, Benedicite Domine, that is, blessed be you, O Lord. Because I meant this with such deep veneration. I said it in a very loud voice, and I was astounded with wonder and admiration that he who is so holy and awe-inspiring was willing to be so familiar with a sinful being living in wretched flesh. I supposed that the time of my temptation had now come, for I thought that God would allow me to be tempted by fiends before I died. With this sight of the blessed passion, along with the Godhead that I saw in my mind, I knew that I, yes, and every creature living, could have strength to resist all the fiends of hell and all spiritual temptation. Is that superb? Starting from this vision that she's having, this showing, that she is able to expand into this complete affirmation of God and the Trinity. It's superb. And I'll add to this just because I want you to get a taste of her language in the Middle English. The version I just read for you was obviously translated. But this is what her writing probably could make your way through most of it, because it's very direct. This is God speaking to Julian. She's writing this down. I, it am. I, it am. I, it am that is highest. I, it am that thou lovest. I, it am that thou likest. I, it am that thou servest. I, it am that thou longest. I, it am that thou desirest. I, it am that thou meanest. I, it am that is all. I, it am that Holy Church preacheth and teacheth thee. I it am that showed me here to thee. I love that opening phrase, I it am. Like, we can't say anything like that in modern English. I it am. I it am. It's almost like the mysterious moment when God, speaking to Moses, says, I am that I am. I it am. I it am. I it am that is highest. I it am that thou lovest. It's great. It's really great. Okay. Our fourth and final mystic this evening, Thomas Merton. There he is. So for a stretch, Thomas Merton was the most famous monk in the world. Thanks to the enduring success of his spiritual autobiography, The Seven-Story Mountain, which chronicles his life of bohemian dissipation in New York City that culminated in his dramatic conversion to Catholicism and then his decision to join the Trappist monastery at Gethsemane in Kentucky. Merton was born in 1915 in France. His parents were painters and bohemians. He grew up in New York and England. His mother died when he was 6. Studying for a year at Clare College, Cambridge, and then he studied at Columbia University. There he met a Hindu monk visiting from Chicago named Mahanambrata Brahmachari, whose spiritually centered quality moved Merton. Brahmachari encouraged Merton to explore his Christian roots rather than convert. And in 1938, 23 years old, Merton was received into the church and baptized. Having received his master's degree in English from Columbia, he intended to pursue a doctorate until he heard the calling to enter the religious life joining Gethsemane 3 years later in 1941. He was 26. The Seven-Story Mountain, one of the spiritual classics of the Christian tradition, was published in 1948, and it made him a literary celebrity. From his place at the monastery, Merton, who took priestly orders in 1949, taking the name Father Lewis, wrote voluminously, publishing dozens of books, ranging from popular books of spiritual advice to more particular books intended for fellow religious, to works about social justice and Christian responsibility. And they touched on race relations, violence, war, to works about the religions of Asia and ecumenism, as well as several volumes of experimental poetry and translation. He was a prolific writer. Despite his short life, and despite his monastic vows, he traveled and lectured widely. And in fact, he was in Bangkok when he died in 1968. He was electrocuted by a short-circuited fan, which evidently he had on his chest. He was cooling off. He was attending an international monastic conference. Merton's imagination about the religious life was original. And this originality is on extensive and pointed display in one of my all-time favorite spiritual works, The Wisdom of the Desert. Got my copy here, which collects and translates the sayings and advice of the Desert Fathers, the psychonauts of the Egyptian desert in the early centuries of Christianity. Yeah, I just use the word psychonauts. They are psychonauts. And these eremites, another fancy word, eremite, it means someone who dwells in the desert. Someone who dwells in the desert. We get the word hermit from it. Eremos is the Greek word for desert. So an eremite is somebody who dwells in the desert. A hermit, that's the Anglified version of eremite. Early, it's not the case anymore, but early in Christianity, if you wanted to know the God of Abraham, you had to go to the desert. You had to go spend some time in the desert to encounter this God. So in these eremites, Merton found extraordinary spiritual sympathies, channeling through them a vision of life in faith marked by austerity, tenderness, wit, vivid humor. So I'm going to give you a taste of some of these because they're just so good. He's translating these from various sources, but he's just got an incredibly light touch when he's talking about these things. So for your benefit, I've included all these up there, just because I thought you'd like them. Once, 2 brethren came to a certain elder whose custom it was not to eat every day, but when he saw the brethren, he invited them with joy to dine with him, saying, "Fasting has its reward, but he who eats out of charity fulfills 2 commandments, for he sets aside his own will and he refreshes his hungry brethren." So companionable. You don't always have to be starving yourself. So said Merton. I love this one. Once, some robbers came into the monastery and said to one of the elders, "We have come to take away everything that is in your cell." And he said, "My sons, take all that you want." So they took everything they could find in the cell and started off. But they left behind a little bag that was hidden in the cell. The elder picked it up and followed after them, crying out, "My sons, take this. You forgot it in the cell." Amazed at the patience of the elder, they brought everything back into his cell and did penance, saying, "This one really is a man of God." That's how you treat the thieves that come to your house. You forgot something. To one of the brethren appeared a devil, transformed into an angel of light, who said to him, "I am the angel Gabriel, and I have been sent to thee." But the brother said, "Think again. You must have been sent to somebody else. I haven't done anything to deserve an angel." Immediately the devil ceased to appear. That's a good one. That's how you vanquish the demons. It's like, think again. And this is one of my all-time favorites. Abbot Lot came to Abbot Joseph and said, "Father, according as I am able, I keep my little rule and my little fast, my prayer, meditation, and contemplative silence. And according as I am able, I strive to cleanse my heart of thoughts. Now, what more should I do?" The elder rose up in reply and stretched out his hands to heaven, and his fingers became like 10 lamps of fire. He said, "Why not be totally changed into fire?" We'll stop there. So I think Marcy has the microphone, and if
Yep.
people have a question or a thought to share, anything's
And
available.
thank you, Peter, for again for sharing such deep wisdom. And so, if you do need to leave, you can leave quietly. But we're going to keep going for the people online so they can enjoy the question and answer. So, if you have a question, raise your hand. I'll bring the mic.
Or a thought. It doesn't have to be a question. Yeah, anything.
Hi, that was absolutely phenomenal. You're
thank
something
you.
else, Peter. It's great to come here and hear you. But what made Julian of Norwich want to stay in a cell like that? I mean, what got to the
Yeah.
got her to get there?
Yeah, what do you think?
I think it was a desire, some sort of a desire to be closer, to
Yeah.
be more centered, maybe.
Yeah, she had this piercing experience of the love of God, and she was near death when she had that experience. She was only 30, and she lived to be
78.
yeah. She lived for a long period. She lived for a long stretch, almost another 40 years, and I think that it was so commanding. The experience so dominated her that she felt she had to be as close to it as she could, and that was an opportunity. Now, there's another part of the story that I think is valuable to acknowledge, which is that she was a woman living in a time when women had no spiritual authority whatsoever, except if they did something like this. Like, here's the extremist thing you can do in your life, and you want people to, you want your vision to be validated by those people. It was one of the available options to her, and she chose it. And that's repeated, as it happens, throughout the history of Christianity, and it's unfortunately not limited to Christianity. That is, women seeking or expressing spiritual authority having to subordinate that to a system that doesn't particularly want to give them voice. We talked last week about Marguerite of Porret, who was burned at the stake for enthusing about God and publishing it in a book. So I think that it's a complicated choice, but it might seem from our perspective to be some kind of deprivation. But I choose to think of it as a creative choice. Like, I think she was pursuing this imaginative vision, and that was a way she could do it. It seems bizarre. I wouldn't be able to tolerate it for more than, experimentally for like a day. I probably wouldn't even last a day. I wouldn't get a phone signal in there. But yeah, it's amazing to think about, isn't it?
Yes.
It is. Yeah. Good question.
I'm sorry.
Please.
One more thing. You mentioned the 6 steps there.
Yeah.
Consciousness being the last one.
Yeah.
I would almost think that would be the first one.
That's a good point. But see, we start with sensation. We start with sensation. This is back to Bonaventure. And that's like touch, feeling, smell. You know, the senses in that sense. Vision in like what you're looking at. And then you notice you're climbing the ladder to deeper and deeper or higher and higher forms of understanding and imagination. And it concludes with your consciousness joining to the divine. So, like the consciousness as we experience it is in this light, it's divinity. In fact, and coming from a completely different place, I've never heard him invoke Bonaventure in this regard. There's a scholar of religion whose work I admire profoundly named Jeffrey Kripal. And Jeffrey Kripal has said in his writings, it's sort of scattered throughout, one of his claims is consciousness is the sacred. He's like, if you want to know what the sacred is, it is consciousness. This thing that we otherwise, we can't really explain. All we can say about consciousness is it's what we experience from the moment we wake up till the moment we go to sleep. But even there, it's not continuous. It's more like, William James, whom we invoked last week, talked about the stream of consciousness. But it's almost like thousands of ball bearings in a drawer that's being shifted. Like that's what consciousness is like. They're just taking on these shapes and forms, and they're always moving. And it's continuous, but there's no predictable formation to it. It's an astonishing part of us as creatures that we have this. I think we have another question.
Actually, this is an
comment.
It's an observation. I
Great.
couldn't help but make a correlation between much of, especially in the beginning, with St. Francis of Assisi,
Yeah.
was with the entire program of Alcoholics Anonymous,
Oh, yeah.
especially the 11th step where we sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood him,
Yeah.
praying only for knowledge of his will for us and the power to carry that out. And there, right in the book, on the 11th step, is the prayer of St. Francis. So it's just that there's no mistakes in this world.
Yeah. That's great. That's really wonderful. That's a wonderful observation. Yeah. No, that's terrific.
I really liked Julian of Norwich. That's really
Yeah.
very startling to think about. But St. Francis has been a real powerful thing for me to explore.
Yeah.
And with him, he went to the caves and isolated himself, and he had these profound moments.
Yes.
So I think she was trying to emulate that as well.
Yes.
So I could see what she did. But I was taken back by a statement you made that, and maybe I heard it wrong, uncreated light, not from God.
No. Uncreated light, it just means it's from outside of creation. It comes from God.
Like it didn't need to be created in order to exist. It always was.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. Does that clarification make sense?
I got to think about it.
Okay. Yeah. It's not. So it's when you start to explore certain strains of Christian theology, you'll come to that word frequently, and it just means that this light was not something God made. There is the light that God made. Let there be light. So that's created light, and that's this energy that suffuses creation. But there's also uncreated light, and in terms of Christian theology, you find this especially in Orthodox theology, but there's a strain of it in Catholic theology as well. The focus would be on the transfiguration. So the scene of the transfiguration is this moment in which the uncreated light of God starts to become visible, showers into creation momentarily. And when we see it, we get a shimmering sense of eternity. Yeah. I think we have another in the back. Maybe further clarification of uncreated light.
Oh, sorry. I just said that. I actually don't remember what I said now.
It sounded great.
I think I said like it didn't need to be like Jesus didn't need to be created, or the Son didn't need to
Yes.
be created in order to exist. Like
Yes,
the Son
correct.
is always with the Father. Like that line in the Creed where we say "begotten, not made," right?
Yes.
So like that the Son is eternally existent in a relationship of love with the Father and the Spirit.
Yes.
I just wanted to bring it back to Julian again. I have always loved her, so this falls more in the more of a comment than a question.
Yeah,
But
please.
I really have always appreciated, because she lived in such an absurdly tumultuous time in
Yes.
human history. And I'm sorry I came in late, so you may have shared this, but like plagues had like
Yeah.
torn through England at the time. Like there had been a gigantic peasant revolt, and there was just like violence pervading her society, right? And so the fact that Julian comes into the middle of this and has these intense, beautiful revelations of God's love, like
Yeah.
she has the most, she has some very intense things, but she has the most tender experiences
Yes.
of the love of God. And there's a line, you probably can quote it better than I, where she has that analogy about, not an analogy because it's part of her vision, but like God's holding all of the world in God's hand as a hazelnut.
Yeah. The hazelnut vision.
Right,
Yep.
but then it ends with this really beautiful, like all will be well and all shall be well and
Yes.
all manner of things shall be well. And she's not saying that in some little utopia that she's in. She's saying that in her tiny stone cell
Yep.
in the midst of chaos unfolding outside.
Yeah.
So
Wow, that's
I say that for
really-
myself as much as for anybody else in the
No,
room. I
that's
think I need to
beautifully
remember
put.
when Julian says that and why.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for sharing that. That's really beautifully put. Yep, that's wonderful. Yeah, it would be another way of understanding something about her creative decision to live in the way that she was living in relation to her times. Yeah.
My question is about the Bonaventure's 6.
Yeah.
And I'm surprised that reason is above imagination based on all the other things that you said about rationality
Yeah.
and Bonaventure.
Yeah, for sure. I suspect he's using the term differently than I am in that context. That's my suspicion because, he climbs up from reason to intelligence. I mean, he was just he was, as I mentioned, he was in Paris at the same time that Aquinas was. And this is this period in which these titanic thinkers, in terms of the church and its history, they are erecting the foundations upon which Christian thought will arise for the next 7, 8, 9, who knows? Like, they're meticulous, logical thinkers in their ways. I think Bonaventure was a little more mystical than Aquinas was, but I think they're cut from a very similar cloth. And this was the thing that I'm just speculating, I'm riffing, but I think this was the thing that they suspected that the church at the time needed. And as they visualized these things, I think they understood imagination differently than at least I began this particular lecture with. I was thinking of it in this more in this more recent sense, which I captioned or I characterized as active imagination, which is something more similar to what you might think of as creative visualization, in the kind of the woo-woo sort of way. But it's along those lines. I don't think that's what Bonaventure means as the second rung on this ladder.
So I have a question and a comment and a question.
Oh, great.
If I heard you correctly, you said something earlier about like the energy of God is unknown and unknowable. Was that?
No, the essence of God
essence.
is unknown and unknowable. The energy of God is what we experience in creation. according to that classic formulation.
Okay, because I'm want to push back on that a bit.
Sure.
And I'm curious about because from my own kind of study of mysticism and Christian and other traditions and my own mystical experiences that I've had, I feel like I've tasted a piece of that essence of God, and that on the path that I'm on, my goal is to become that essence, and it's aspirational.
Yeah.
And through mystical experiences, one can have a taste of that.
Sure.
And so I'm curious, like, if you could respond to that, and if others have had similar experiences that they'd like to share.
Yeah, that's a great, I really like that. I'm using the language that comes from a theological, let's call it a theological strain or a theological tradition that partly is reflected, and I'll be talking about this in some more detail in 2 weeks, comes from Orthodox Christian theology, where there was a series of controversies that had to do especially with, I'll go back to this image here that we started with. It had to do with the controversy connected with icons and iconography. And in fact, it led to this period of what was known as iconoclasm, which means destroying of icons. And this happened because there were Christians at the time who believed that these icons were being worshipped. So it wasn't that God was being worshipped or Christ or the saints represented in them were being venerated, but rather it was almost a form of idolatry. So it was a kind of Puritanistic moment, at least before that term existed to refer to an actual religious sect. And the controversy endured for, it wasn't limited to icons, but that kind of was the most cataclysmic expression of it. In fact, all these early icons in Eastern Christendom, I mean, a number of them were destroyed. The ones that survived were sort of out of the reach of the controversy. So one of the formulations that arose as a way of understanding what was happening with icons was the clarification that God has essence and energy, and we cannot know God's essence. It belongs to God. It's outside of creation. But God's energy suffuses creation, and that energy is the way that we approach God's essence. So if I can connect to your own personal experience and your description there, I think in those terms, I'm not going to speak about your experience or pass any judgment or characterization on it, but I think that is what you're tasting. It's the energy would be what is leading you towards the essence, and you're getting this foretaste. You're getting a foretaste through this energetic suffusion. Yeah, please. I'm going to say no, and this is going to seem like a dodge, artful or otherwise. Come back in 2 weeks, because that's all that the lecture is about. That's all that we're going to be talking about, is how you get there. And my favorite characterization of that process is the figure that we're going to conclude with, who is the 20th century mystic, paleontologist, Jesuit, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And I think chef's kiss, the chef's kiss of the quality of union that you just described, that's what I see in his work. Yeah, so, yeah, I guess that's the advertisement for we're not meeting on Thanksgiving. Don't come here next week. Enjoy your families.
I have something that I'd like clarified, please. You've referred to Saint Bonaventure,
Yes.
and you've referred to Saint Francis.
Yes.
I didn't hear you say anything about Thomas Merton. Is he a saint?
No.
He is not.
No.
And how about Julian of Norwich? Is she a
No.
saint? Oh, what she went through, and she's not a saint.
She deserves it, but no.
Is
So
that
maybe
church?
the answer is not yet.
Oh. How about that church where where she was in that cell? Does that still exist?
Well, the sculpture that I showed you, the image that I showed you, comes from that church. So I've never been there, so I don't know. But obviously, it's commemorated at least in this respect. So that statue comes from the church. Yeah, Merton, not a saint yet. We'll say that. Yet. We don't know. He's got a ways to go, I'm sure.
Right. Okay, hold on, we got one more.
I just wanted to come back to the idea of consciousness. It's a very interesting thing how during the Reformation and earlier times we separated science from spirituality and religion. And I think we're seeing a reunification of some of that. And I can say through some of my studies that are current, people are trying to identify where's the soul in the body. In ancient traditions, it was the pineal gland. It was the seat of the soul, and we could access that through the eyes. So eyes are very important.
Yeah.
And now science is trying to have a discussion about where's consciousness. Does it reside within the physical body, or is it something much greater than the physical body, and how we're connected through this matrix that transcends, is out in the universe, or multiple dimensions, universes, whatever we might think that to be. And how do even things like single cells in a petri dish communicate? Why do we synchronize in our lives with the moon and the celestial bodies? And I think that's a great kind of lead-in for Peter's book as well. But there is such a thing called the Existential Consciousness Research Institute, and it's spearheaded by a bunch of philosophers and quantum physicists that have this dialogue that is attempting to unify, and I always think it's kind of a cyclical philosophical argument. But what we think really doesn't exist, we're coming to find with advances in technology does exist. Are we trying to quantify a spiritual experience or a unification with God, or this wonderful experience that Teilhard de Chardin describes to us? I would say he's a hero of mine. And,
me too.
So more to come. And just one last thing before we close we have something coming up in March. And do you want to say something about that?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for coming and participating. And as Peter said, we will have the third lecture in this series on Thursday, November 30th.
Correct.
Thank you. I was hoping that was the right date. So Thursday, November 30th. So in 2 weeks, we'll come back for unification. So I hope you all are able to come back. And then in March 11th, Monday, March 11th, we'll be back in this room with Father John Deere. John Deere is a well-known peace activist, over the decades, and he's written about 37 books, and just recently he wrote a book on the gospel of peace. And so he's going to be coming to share some of his insights with us, to talk about his book, to sign books, and so really encourage you to put that on your calendar too. So it'd be a nice thing for Lent to be thinking about peace and what Christ calls us to in this time of difficulty, not unlike Julian of Norwich's time. So Thank you again. Thank you all, and have a blessed night.